Welcome to part 3 of a series where we're going to be building a social media with React and Django. In the previous video, we created our authentication with JWT tokens, as well as built out a user login and registration. However, in this video, we're going to be building private routes with React, so a user won't be able to access the app unless they are logged in. So at the moment, if I go to the URL and type in a user, you can see we actually are able to go to their profile, but what should happen is that we should just be directed back to the login. So that's what we're going to be building out in this video. But before we get started, I just wanted to say that a lot of effort goes into this series. So if you could like and comment on the video and subscribe to the channel if you're not, it really supports me and keeps me from making these tutorials. So with that said, let's get into it. I'm back in my text editor, and before we start building our private routes in React, we need to spend 2 minutes just creating a simple API that checks if we're an authenticated user. So we go into our backend, base, and use.py file. Then we need to create a new API. So just like usual, create an @API view, and it's going to be a GET request. And to check if we're authenticated, all we have to do is pass in our permission classes. So it's going to be a simple just return something, but if we're not authenticated, it's just going to throw an error. So if we do, we'll just call it authenticated. Then you can return any response really. Like I said, if it won't return anything if we're not authenticated. So I'll just return authenticated, okay? Now we need to call this from our urls.py file. So if we import it, then create that path. Now we can go into our browser and then call this API. So you can see that we're not authenticated. However, if we log in, so go to our token API, which is going to log us in, and we log into our user, you can see we got a successful login. We'll have our cookies in our browser, and I can get this now, and you can see we're authenticated, okay? So we're going to call this in our front end to see if we're authenticated, and it's going to allow us to have access to our private routes. So with that done, we can go back into our browser, we can close these and dive into our front end, okay? So I'm going to open this. Now, what we need is a variable called authenticated, which our whole app can access, because every page is going to need to access this variable, right? And we can do this with a React hook called useContext, and this is going to allow us to have access and change the state of authenticated, basically. So what we're going to do is, I'm just going to walk you through it. We create a folder called contexts. We create a file called useAuth, okay, for authentication. Do .js, okay. So we have to import a few things. So we're going to import create context. Actually, just get rid of this. From React. Then use context, use state, and use effect, okay? So when creating contexts, we have to create an auth context, an auth provider, and then use auth. And use auth is what we're going to call in the rest of our app to get our authenticated value, okay? And you'll see as this plays out, it's quite simple, so not to worry. So like I said, we're going to create our auth context. So literally auth context, and we create that context. Then we need to create an auth provider, which is going to wrap around our routes so that all our routes can access this authenticated variable we want, okay? So call it auth provider. It's going to take in children, which is going to be all our routes as it's going to wrap around them. And then we need to return an auth provider, which is written like auth context dot provider. And then we have our children inside here, okay, as these are going to be all our routes. And then we also pass in all our values which we want to give to our children, what they can access, such as our authenticated variable. So we'd create that authenticated variable. So we'll call it auth and set auth. So by default, this should be false. It should not be authenticated by default. And we also need to create another state called auth loading. And by default, that's going to be true. So auth loading is going to be the period where our front end hasn't received our data from our back end, because it's going to be making an API call to see if we're authenticated or not. But there's going to be time in between, even if it's a few milliseconds, where we haven't got that data. So we just need to give a loading screen. So next thing I want to do is call our backend. So we want to make that API call to see if we are authenticated. So we'll stick to good coding practices and just build it in our endpoint.js file. We can just copy and paste the get request we've already made and just adjust it. So we'll just call it get auth, and it's not going to pass any username. And if we go into our backend urls.py file, we called it authenticated. Okay. That looks good to me. So that's our endpoint. We can import that here. So what we're going to do is create a function that's going to check our authentication. If we are authenticated, it will set auth to true. If we're not, it will set it to false. And then once it's got a value, it will set auth loading to false. So create check auth. It's going to be asynchronous. We're making an API call. Now we'll do a try, catch, and a finally. So in this try, we're going to make our API call. So get auth. If it's successful, it will happen in, it will execute the code in here. So we need to set auth to true. Then in catch, we're going to handle our errors. So we want to set auth to false, as we are not authenticated in our backend. And then once we've got either of these, we want to set auth loading to false, as we've got our data now. So I want to check our authentication every time we go to a new page, right? So we can do that by using useState. So useEffect, sorry. So useEffect. Like I said, we want to check it every time we go to a new page. So we can look at the URL, and if the URL changes, then we'll call everything in here. So window.location.pathname window, and we'll call our check auth function. Okay. Now we can pass in our auth and auth loading, and we also need to make one more thing. Okay. So at the moment, if we go into routes and login, you can see we're using this functionality here. But what we want is when we log in, it should set auth straight to true if it's successful. So if we create our own function called auth login, which takes in the username and a password, and we'll just call this from our login component. Okay. And then we can essentially just copy and paste everything in here, except if we're successful, we'll set auth to true. Okay. And then we'll pass this into our values, so the rest of our app can access this. But as we're using navigate, we need to create our own navigate variable. So const navigate, let's use navigate. Now we want our login page to be able to use this auth login. Okay, and the way we're going to do this is create our useAuth function. So we call this useAuth, and it's going to be a useContext for our auth context. So that's how it's written. And when we call useAuth, we can access everything in here. So if we export this, and we also export this, and before we can actually even use this, we need to wrap our app with our auth provider. So let's go into app.js, import our auth provider, and then we need to wrap it around our routes. Then you can just place that inside there. Okay. So now we can use our useAuth in the rest of our components. So we can go back to login, and we can get rid of this as we're not using it anymore. And we can call useAuth. We can just grab what we need from here. So we're going to use auth login, and we could just call auth login. Get rid of that. So, and we also, we need to import login here as well in our useAuth. So useAuth, and we didn't import useAuth here. It's always something. There you go. Let's just test if it works. Looks like it's working to me. So we haven't got any errors. And if I get, you can log out using this. We'll create a logout button in the next couple of videos. So you can just get rid of your cookies like this. And because we don't have our cookies anymore, we're going to be logged out. But we're still not taken to our login page. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to build our PrivateRoute. So if we go into components, we'll create a new file called PrivateRoute.js. And we'll create a component. So we need to make a few imports. So we'll import auth provider, not auth provider, sorry, useAuth, and we'll import a navigate component. So in this PrivateRoute, we're going to get our authenticated value from our useAuth to check if we're authenticated or not. We're also going to grab our auth loading from useAuth. So while it's loading, we'll return a loading page. But once we've stopped loading, if we are authenticated, we'll show the route we're going to. But if we're not authenticated, it will navigate us back to the login page. So if we just code this, const grabbing auth and auth loading, auth and auth loading. So if we are loading, then return some text, port text, just saying loading, whatever. But once that stopped happening, if we are authenticated, we want to return our route. So if we just pass our route into our PrivateRoute, we can just return the route itself. However, if we're not authenticated, we'll return this navigate component, which will take us back to the login page. Okay, so now we need to go to app.js, import it, and we'll wrap it around our user profile, just like this. Then grab that. So you can see user profile is a child of PrivateRoute. And if I try and go to MattMakesCode, you see I can't do that anymore. And if I log in, I should be able to go, just like that. So that's how we do private routes in React. And that's the end of everything I wanted to show for this video. In the next video, we're going to create the following functionality so we can follow users and unfollow them. And when we go to a different user profile page, they won't have this edit profile button, they'll have a following button instead, or an unfollowing button. So thanks for watching this video. If you're sticking along on this journey, can you please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and like and comment on the video. Thanks.